Welcome, everyone, to season 2 of Hurricane Hunt. It's meteorologist Joe Martucci. Join with me, my weather brother, Sean Sublette. Sean, I don't want to say happy hurricane season being June 1st, but we'll just say it's here.
It is here. It is time. I think a lot of head space has been out there in the weather enterprise these last 2 or 3 months with good reason, as we do expect it to be a very active season, right, Joe?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's kick it off with our season preview. The big takeaway, a very active Atlantic hurricane season expected. And last year was pretty active too, but you look at some of these forecasts that are coming out and could be more active than that. Warm ocean waters as well as a La Nina are the reasons. We were in an El Nino over the winter. We're transitioning into La Nina. That makes a difference. And the peak of hurricane season is mid August to mid October. So, for the next 2.5 months, it's kind of a slow developing process, hurricane season, but it really starts to get going as we go into mid August. Sean, take us through our hurricane season preview.
Yes, just about everybody I know who does this line of work expects a very active season. And we'll go with our colleagues here at Colorado State, been doing this for more than 40 years. Their forecast is for 23 named storms this year, with 11 of those becoming hurricanes, five of those becoming major hurricanes. Last year was active, even though it was an El Nino year, which tends to cut back on hurricane formation. There were 20 named storms and seven hurricanes last year. And when you compare that to normal, even that was a lot more active than a typical or normal season. And so that's why we're really concerned so much for this year, especially as we get into the meat of this season later on into the summer and early fall. Take us through the names this year. Everybody wants to know if their name is on the list this year, Joe.
Yeah, so here we go. There's no Sean and there's no Joe on this, so that's good. But here are the list of hurricane names. Now, most of these are borrowed from the 2018 list. Every 6 years, we reuse the hurricane name list, removing hurricanes that have been retired by the World Meteorological Organization. Now, it is likely that we actually go through this list if you look at some of the hurricane forecasts like Colorado State being put out. So, what we have after William is a supplemental list of English names that are used if we get past William, and they can be retired as well. If you recall or might recall, back in 2020, we were still using the Greek alphabet after we got past the W. But what happened was we had, first of all, a number of Greek alphabet names used, but some of those could have been retired just because of the sheer magnitude of devastation it brought. It kind of created a situation we haven't been in before. The World Meteorological Organization decided to scrap the Greek names, go with this supplemental list of English names that will come through. Now, like we said at the top, hurricane season is going to start slow, and that's what climatology shows.
Yeah, so, if it's not overly busy in June or July, that has nothing to do with how the rest of the season is going to play out. It is very normal and expected for the months of June and July to be relatively slow. Then it really picks up from mid-August, September, and October before falling off very quickly later on in the fall. So take us through the big map, Joe. This really highlights, I think, pretty well where the active locations typically are during the course of hurricane season.
Yeah, so let's start it off here. And fantastic graphic. And I think it really illustrates how hurricane season develops. This is June. And you see a lot of this blue kind of along the United States into Mexico. Not many storms here, but a lot of these storms, they'll kind of be formed off of cold fronts that pass through. And it's in that warm water and it can develop and create some of these closer to home storms. But there's still not many. When you get into July, you see a number of named storms going off the Carolina coast, north of Bermuda. That's because you have that Bermuda high setting up, clockwise flow around Bermuda. These storms will curve many times between the U.S. and Bermuda. That's what we're hoping for, although sometimes, as we know, it's going to go into land. August, you see these colors are starting to flare up here. You see these oranges and reds, and you start to see these tropical systems being pushed well into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean near the tropics. We start calling these Cape Verde storms, Cabo Verde storms, that roll off the coast of Africa, pass through the Cabo Verde Islands, and move west. These long track storms, where we could be talking about a hurricane for 10 or 12 days. This continues and only strengthens into September. This is the peak of hurricane season. You'll see a lot of us on your screen as we go into August and September. We update as needed. It's not like we're doing this every Monday like we did with Snow Search. These are as needed. But you see that track starting off the Cabo Verde Islands, moving towards the Antilles. And then once it gets around Bermuda, or I should say, as it gets towards that Bermuda high pressure, it starts to curve clockwise. Hopefully, it stays between Bermuda and the United States. But again, we know, especially Carolinas, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, you're going to see more than likely some kind of landfalling storm there. We go into October, that's when we start to see this shrinking back down, with that development region mainly from Bermuda going into the Bahamas and Florida. And then by November, it's tough to get these storms. The ocean waters are cooling off. If they do, they're generally closer to home, meaning us in the United States. Sometimes they form out in the middle of the open Atlantic here. So, Sean, one thing I think we need to pay attention to is the Saharan dust, right? So we can have super warm water temperatures, we can be in a La Nina, but that only tells some of the story.
Yeah, that's kinda like the fuel for the storms. We've gotta get them started in the first place, and one of the ways we can keep them from forming, if you will, is we watch these waves of dust coming off of the Sahara Desert and into the open Atlantic. We've got generally winds from the east in that part of the world during the tropical season. So as dust is occasionally picked up off of the Sahara and sent into the Atlantic Ocean, it impacts the atmosphere. Thinking back a little bit, to get hurricanes or any tropical cyclone to form in the first place, you need a lot of moisture in the middle levels of the atmosphere and very warm water, typically above 80, but it can form at 76 or 77 degrees. That dust moves into the lower and middle part of the atmosphere. It does a couple of things. Some of the sunlight's reflected, that cuts down on the water temperature. It dries out the middle part of the atmosphere as well. So these two things make it more challenging for hurricanes to form. It doesn't prevent them from forming, but it certainly makes it more difficult for them to form. So if you're rooting for a season that is not busy, you want to root for the African dust for this year. So we'll see how that plays out. Forecasting that this far in advance is there's just not much skill in that at all.
Yeah.
Now there are some new products coming out from the National Hurricane Center in 2024 to help kind of guide people through the hurricane warning process. Take us through some of those, Joe.
Yeah, and, I'll say too, some years the updates are pretty minor. I think this year's a pretty significant update, or significant updates from the National Hurricane Center. We'll lead off with this, that hurricane forecast cone map. We talk about that cone of uncertainty now is going to show tropical storm or hurricane watches and warnings for counties inland. This graphic, I think almost all of us have seen. This comes from the National Hurricane Center, and that this is an example storm. This isn't actually happening, but you see most of Florida is in blue with some red areas and yellows. Before, it was only the coast and the coastal counties that this was being shown. So this isn't a forecasting change, but this is a communication change. So
Yeah.
if you live in Orlando, or even if you live in Raleigh, North Carolina, you're in a tropical storm warning, you'll see it on this map and you'll know if you are in danger more quickly here. We'll also look at some other notes as well for 2024. The expansions of Spanish language advisories. We've done a really good job in the past 20 years of trying to communicate to our friends in the Caribbean, primarily Spanish speaking countries, as well as here in the United States. We're seeing more of these advisory products being put in Spanish for enhanced communication. An increase in when watches and warnings can be issued is one of these as well. Up until this year, they could only be issued four times a year, 4 times a day: 5 a.m., 11 a.m., 5 p.m., and 11 p.m. with those main forecast updates. Now they can be done within the intermediate advisories, for example, 8 a.m., 2 p.m., or 8 p.m. And Sean, I'll let you have it for the last one here with the forecast cone.
Yeah, I mean, the when we look at the forecast cone, strictly speaking, it tells us what the historical errors have been in hurricane forecasting, position forecasting historically, and they're a little bit better. So that's being incorporated into that forecast cone for 2024. I just want to go back to the point you made earlier, also, Joe, with the maps in terms of where the watches and warnings are gonna be. Coloring the states, I think goes a long way in showing people where impacts are gonna be when you're far away from the coastline. Because so often you can be lulled into a false sense of security. You're like, "Well, I'm not in the cone," or "The cone's far away." One of the things we try to drive home, impacts are far away from the cone, not just wind, but water. Water, 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 flooding, flooding, flooding. Yes, the wind's bad at the coast, but once you go inland, flooding is more and more the issue. All right, so let's take it home and wrap it all up, Joe.
Yeah, so I just want to make this note too. There are three states since 1980 that have seen at least $125 billion in hurricane damage: Florida, Louisiana, and Texas. All of them coastal states, yes, but they also have significant populations inland. You think about Houston, right? Or you think about
Yeah,
Orlando, Florida. Those places also accounting for this. That comes from our friends at Climate Central. But I
yeah,
think in terms of the hurricane season, there is a lot that is saying, hey, this is going to be very active. We also want to say that this doesn't mean that the landfalls will be more than usual. It could
right.
be, but that doesn't necessarily mean that. So, I think we're at liberty to say we're hoping that this hurricane season, if it's a busy one, stays all out in the open Atlantic. We don't have to deal with any of these. But again, we're talking about a potentially, very, very active hurricane season in the
Yeah,
Atlantic.
when we talk about an active season, we mean the total number of storms. That does not in any way, shape, or form say specifically about landfall in a location or how many landfalls there are going to be. It's just a statistical thing. There's going to be more of them out there, which means the risk of a landfall is going to go up. So any of the traditional hurricane prone areas in the southeast of the Gulf Coast should just be especially aware this season.
Yep. All right, so we're gonna say goodbye for our first episode of season 2 of Hurricane Hunt. Like we said in the middle of the episode, we are going to do these as needed. So if you don't hear from us for a little while, it's not that we're not here anymore. It's just that when the storms are
It's a
here,
good
we will
sign.
update. And a Category 5 hurricane that's close to the United States, we're going to be updating multiple times a day for something like that. If it's out in the open Atlantic, it's not going to impact land. We will do an episode, but those updates won't be as frequent. So just to give you guys a rundown of what our schedule will be for you here, we have an episode of our Across the Sky podcast, new episodes every Monday, where we talk with Colorado State University about the hurricane season forecast. So you can check that out there. But for meteorologist Sean Sublette, I'm Joe Martucci, and thank you for watching this episode of Hurricane Hunt.